Hi, my name is Chris Olson, and this is the case study for Module 9 of AEP 855 at Fort Hays State University. So in this case study, to summarize the case, the location of this incident is a fictional place called Rocket Junior High, and the parties involved are the assistant principal, Richard Inman, who's a first-year assistant principal, James, who is a student, David Ramos, who is a student, the school resource officer, or SRO, there's no name provided for this character, as well as the director of secondary education, or DSE, and once again, for this person, there was no name provided. To summarize the case, James is a troubled teen, was called to the office for being tardy. On the way to the office, he gave an object to another student, David, and threatened him not to speak. This was observed by another teacher who called down to the office to let them know about this situation, so David was called into the office as well. And when it was asked what was given to him, he said that he didn't want to say anything. He basically started to tear up and everything. He was searched, and brass knuckles were discovered on his person by the SRO. James confessed that the weapon was his, and that his action in threatening David basically told David that if David said anything, James was going to beat him up. Both students were arrested based on district policy and expelled. Mr. Inman chose not to fill out the paperwork, at least initially, for David, but was instructed to do so by the DSE or face an official reprimand. To report any legal or ethical issues, every single character within this case scenario kind of has their own things going on that they have to think about. For Assistant Principal Inman, he faces the ethical decision of following the district policy or advocating for change and facing a possible official reprimand on his record. For the SRO and the DSE, both of these individuals are following the policy and our laws of the district to the letter based on their actions and what we were told in the case study. And failure to do so for them could result in them facing the same consequences as Assistant Principal Inman. And James threatened David, which would likely fall into the harassment policy of the district if they have one. He's also breached student conduct by having a weapon on school grounds, and he does have a pattern of getting into trouble with the district. And then there's David. David was harmed by the threat of violence made towards him by James, but in the end he did break the law by possessing a weapon on school grounds, even if he was forced into this decision by another. He is harmed by the swift decision to expel him without his legal right to a fair hearing and everything else that goes along with anytime that you are going to expel somebody, there's a set of procedures that needs to take place. So basically, to synthesize this case, educational leaders must assess each situation for its ethical merits and make a decision based on whether to follow district policy and prescribed laws or to advocate for ethical and legal decisions. And this is the case that is presented to Assistant Principal Mr. Inman. Take a little bit closer look at the various people that are involved in this case study. There's not much information given about any of them. The assistant principal, Richard Inman, this is his first year as an assistant principal. He grew up in what they term as the South Side in the case study. He's trying to use that to influence other kids from the South Side, playing basketball with them after school hours, things like that, to try to improve their academics and behavior at school. James is one of these kids from the South Side. He's a troubled 15-year-old teen, heavily tattooed. He routinely is getting in trouble, but it seems like the assistant principal Inman's efforts are kind of making ground. It said in the case study that James hadn't gotten into a fight for months, which was like a record for him. So he's making headway with changing the behavior of these teens from the South Side. David Ramos is a 13-year-old honor student. He doesn't have any discipline violations on his record, and he's involved in the school's band. The SRO, there's really not any information provided about the school resource officer, besides the fact that the school resource officer was in the assistant principal's office when this event took place and arrested David and handcuffed him. The director of secondary education, there's really no information provided about this individual as well, beyond the fact that they contacted assistant principal Inman to say you have to write the expulsion form for David. James's mother was not really surprised by James's action. Like it said previously, he was a troubled teen, was constantly in trouble, and it says in the case study that this would be several times that he's gotten into trouble and had the consequence of going to an alternative placement school. David's mother was confused as to how her son could be in trouble when the other kid admitted to threatening her son with bodily harm if he told anyone about the brass knuckles. And James admitted that he forced David to take the weapon while in the assistant principal's office with the SRO present. The place where this is taking place is Rocket Junior High. They don't really give us a lot of details about this location. We know that it has 900 students, and the demographics were never really discussed. However, it was implied that the Southside students tend to have more issues, which is why Assistant Principal Inman was reaching out to them to try and improve their academics and their behavior. The main location within this school that this scenario takes place is Assistant Principal Inman's office. Both students were brought into the office along with the SRO for when the weapon was found in David's possession. And there's also the Disciplinary Alternative Education Program, or DAEP. This is an alternative program for the district for troubled students. James has been there numerous times. David has never been there, but with the weapons violation, it would send both students to the DAEP for 45 days. And the program that is in question here is Rocket Junior High. It appears to be a public school, although this is never expressly stated. And the DEAP is an alternative educational environment, students who have gotten into trouble. And that's about all the information that we know in regards to the program in question. So anytime that you're asked to look at a case study and you have minimal information and you're trying to figure out what type of a solution you would propose, what type of a final solution should take place, what direction you should go with it, it's important to review and prioritize the information. So could the conflict situation or the decision be damaging to stakeholders or to the community? Well, the biggest stakeholders in this situation are Mr. Inman, David, and James. James is facing yet another mark on his juvenile record. David is facing his first major consequences, but it is one that could also impact his future, as he could have a juvenile record at that point in time that could impact this honor student from possibly being accepted to various universities, colleges, trade schools, or anything else beyond high school. Mr. Inman faces the possibility of having an official reprimand added to his file based on his decision of whether or not he fills out the expulsion paperwork for David. He has done so for James. He's just questioning whether he should do so for David. Other stakeholders include the district, the parents, and the SRO. This decision could create a precedent for similar cases that might occur in the future, so that is something that could be damaging or definitely does influence the district itself. The parents can be damaged by the actions through the legal fees and costs associated with any type of arrest. We know that within our criminal justice system that anything that goes through it, there's going to be some sort of fine or monetary value levied based on it, may possibly need to hire lawyers and things like that. And the SRO might also face discipline due to the fact that he handcuffed only David, even though both students were transported to jail. There might be a policy that says anyone that's transported to jail needs to be handcuffed. Also, since James admitted that the brass knuckles were his, it seems odd that David was the one that was handcuffed and James was not. There are a lot of different individuals and groups that have an important stake in the outcome of the decision from this case study. Mr. Inman, this is, for him, it's an ethical decision. Does he follow the county policy, the district policy, or does he look at this ethically and decide to buck the policy and go his own route with what he makes his decision with? There's James. There's always the possible criminal consequences, and it seems, based on what it says in this case study, that he's basically a repeat offender. So as those continue to accrue, the consequences most likely get worse and worse for him. David, there's the possible criminal consequences and the impact that that could have on his future. The school resource officer, there's the procedural punishment that could come into question with the fact that he only handcuffed David and not James. Students at Rocket Junior High, this would impact them as well, because whatever decision is made about David in this case, with James having come forward and said, yes, they were mine, I threatened David to take my brass knuckles, whatever the district decides could affect what the rest of the students choose to do if something like this happens to them in the future. Parents of both students, they face the possibility of having to pay legal fees, pay lawyer fees, things like that for the criminal felony charges that are coming against both students based on the brass knuckles. The DSE, is he following the leadership guidelines to evaluate, communicate about, and advocate for ethical and legal decisions? You just know that he's telling Mr. Inman, you got to fill out this paperwork. And the DAEP, the alternative education place, they need to know whether or not to expect 2 new students, 1 or none. Have all of the relevant stakeholders been consulted prior to the decision to take the 2 students to jail? No. At that point in time, Assistant Principal Inman, James, David, and the SROs were the only ones that knew about the situation, really. The parents had not been informed, the DSE had not been informed, and they were not informed until both of the students were on their way to jail. Can I learn more about the situation? Yeah, there's definitely some things within this case study that are not mentioned. Like, is there a planned expulsion here and prior to required start at DAEP? What is the DSE stake in this if Mr. Inman decides not to file the paperwork? Who does he have to answer to? There's definitely a lot of information that would be good to know, but that's what makes this a chance for us to be able to evaluate what we do have and form a decision based on what we know. And do I know enough to make a decision? If I was acting as Mr. Inman, I would have to say yes, although gathering additional information could alter that decision if I hadn't. So it's important to look at, when you're making any sort of ethical decision, the various different options. What are the possible consequences to each of these options? So that way you can evaluate them and try to come up with the best possible solution. So to look at the various options I came up with, the first one, the right-wing one, is just to follow the policy, complete the expulsion paperwork for David, wipe your hands of it, and be done with it. Left wing would be to completely ignore the DSE, your superior essentially, don't file the paperwork, and go to the BOE and start to fight to have the policy updated so that this does not happen to somebody like David again. Other possible solutions would be to file the paperwork but then appeal to the BOE and the DSE to look at and possibly change the policy. Or else you could ignore the paperwork, take the consequence, and allow the DSE to file it himself or the principal to file it himself or herself if they wish to. You could also speak to the building principal and other staff to see what their opinions are and see if you have others with similar beliefs that would support your decision with whatever your decision ends up being. You could also look at consulting the district lawyer about possible consequences for all proposed actions. Like I said, that's one of the ones where we don't have all the information. It seems like there are probably some federal or state or district policies, laws that are kind of being brushed aside right now within this case study, and it might be worth consulting a lawyer with. To actually evaluate these possible solutions, if you follow the policy, complete the expulsion paperwork for David, while this does follow district policy, it does mean that David will be charged with a felony. It does mean that he's going to be placed in an alternative school for 45 days and that he will have that expulsion on his record, even though James said that he threatened David to take the brass knuckles. If you ignore the DSE, don't file the paperwork, and fight to have the policy updated with the BOE, it initially provides David with a reprieve and works to change the policy to allow for different situations to be handled differently. It will most likely result in an official reprimand for Mr. Inman. And eventually, who knows, maybe they decide that the paperwork for David needs to be filled out and he still gets charged and has to go to the expulsion and DAEP. File the paperwork, but then appeal to the BOE and DSE to look at and change the policy. This follows the policy, but then it looks to proactively change what is happening to David and ensure that a similar situation does not happen again. This does mean that David would most likely have to spend some time at the DAEP, but it does work to try to rectify the situation after the fact. Not the best scenario, but it's something that you could look at doing. You could ignore the paperwork, take the consequence, and then allow the DSE to follow it himself if he wishes to. This shows David and his family that you are on their side. It shows the district your views on the existing policy concerning the situation, and it comes with a likely official reprimand and can appear as if you're unwilling to act. Do you have the courage to actually act as a leader? You can speak with the building principal and other staff to see what their opinions are. This looks to bring in the building principal and gain their opinion on the situation. It states within the case study that this is Mr. Inman's first year as an assistant principal, which means that he still has a lot to learn. A more experienced advice from the principal could be beneficial. Speaking to those that know each of the students will provide more background on each of them, both David and James, to help justify a final position. This could take time, and an official reprimand might still occur prior to a final decision. David might still end up in the DAEP, at least initially, even if you don't file the paperwork. It's hard to tell. And then the last possible solution I came up with was to consult the district lawyer about possible consequences. Most districts have some sort of legal representation. This method would allow Mr. Inman to see if all procedures were followed or if there are policies and laws that must be considered prior to making the decision to charge David and place him in DAEP, expel him. This could also help to ensure that David's family does not file suit with the district for negligence, because when I was in my educational law class, there are a lot of situations where negligence comes up with things that you would never contemplate as being like I can't believe somebody sued for that, but it does happen. This decision would also place David in limbo, though, as he and his family would not know the final outcome for a longer period of time. So after looking at the various solutions that I came up with, it was time to choose what I thought of as the best option, which door to open, which door to go through. And I kind of decided to go with a hybrid of some of the different initial proposals. And I thought that contacting the DSE and informing them that there is background information that's still needed in order to form a decision about whether or not to fill out the paperwork, regardless of policy, would be a good first step. And then to have that time to be able to speak to the building principal to gain their expertise and experience. Look to the other leaders in the building. Speak with the district lawyer about the situation, see if all policies were followed correctly and decisions were made correctly for both the benefit of the students as well as the district. And then whatever happens in steps 1 through 3 to help build that further background knowledge might shift the final decision. But based on the facts that we were presented with after going through these steps, I believe that the proper response would be to inform the DSE that you're unwilling to file the expulsion paperwork and provide your reasoning. They were James's brass knuckles. He threatened David to hold on to them. David didn't want to break the threat and possibly get beaten up by James, and so he teared up and everything. James admitted to all of this. Back up this decision of why you won't fill out the expulsion paperwork with any information that you gain through conversation with the principal or with the district lawyer. Accept an official reprimand if it comes to pass. And then from there, go on and start to push the BOE and the district to look at this policy and make alterations to it. This is a situation in which personal courage is needed, which is one of the principles of leadership. And Lynch, in his article, wrote that administrators must be willing to stand up against policies that they feel are not helpful for their students, rising against both local, state, and national interests as needed. In my opinion, expelling David in this situation is unethical, and his rights should be fought for. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and I hope you enjoyed it.